Vietnam, where the world's most powerful military in mild terms, suffered. A term everyone since Nam now knows and loves, guerrilla tactics, appears at the forefront of everyone's minds when envisioning combat in the unforgiving woods. A Charlie, creeping down the edge of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ready to burst a 7.62 by 39mm into a grizzled butterbar and his platoon. But what most people don't know was that Vietnam was really a war of attrition, hit-and-run operations merely complementing raids of hamlets that, when lost, took a painstaking amount of blood and guts to recover. This exposition aims to delve into the nature of combat in every dimension theater, from the side of the PIAVN and NLF versus the USA and the ARVN. The seas. The PIAVN and NLF had a sorely limited flotilla. The Chinese and USSR sent the North Vietnamese an assortment of gunboats, torpedo boats, and a handful of littoral vessels. Their tactic was to charge at a cruiser and fire torpedoes, RTB, return to base. There was little else their ill-equipped naval forces could muster, given that they brought a brown water, which was at best a green water fleet, to a fight with a nation that commanded the largest navy in the world. The USA had the world's largest navy, possessing some 24 fixed and rotary-winged carriers, battleships of 20-plus ton displacement, crewed by more sailors than the population of 5 average villages. The Americans had a significant advantage over the North Vietnamese forces, boasting top-of-the-line equipment and strategies developed through centuries of warfare. One of the Navy's earliest engagements with their brand-new signal intelligence VAN-T kit was a DeSoto mission by the DDX Maddox, which is notable due to its role in prompting the direct escalation of the Vietnam War. Other than the power of the vessels America had to cordon off the North Vietnamese waters, the USA had an assortment of thousands of fixed and rotary-winged aircraft, conducting missions such as CAS, Close Air Support, CAP, Combat Air Patrol, Medevac, CASEVAC, bombing runs, interception, reconnaissance, transport, exfiltration, and infiltration. Most notably, aircraft played a major role in Operation Rolling Thunder, where 643,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the population, alongside the evacuation of Saigon, where thousands were flown to safety after North Vietnam captured the South Vietnamese capital. The South Vietnamese fleet was relegated to a support logistical role, aiding the larger American Navy. The famous Devil boats were also utilized for special warfare operations during the Vietnamese War, drifting into riverside bases to accomplish objectives. The multifaceted roles and tactics of the American Navy helped secure the Vietnamese front from the air and sea, giving the USA a mostly contained zone to operate in. The air, the PIAVN and PLF had few Ilyushins that the USSR gave them, and had a fair number of multi-role fighters and interceptors. Their air force relied mostly on the interception of enemy bombers, considering the clear inequality between their retention of airspace versus the South Vietnamese forces. These fighters shot down bombers in operations such as Cedar Falls and Linebacker, helping protect whatever little industry the North Vietnamese had. Their doctrine was to prowl upon slow, lumbering bombers and take them down from a high or low altitude at rapid speeds, relying heavily on dogfighting compared to the Americans who used missiles much more. The rotary-winged aircraft were used to ferry resources and men, along with close air support at times. The Viet Minh also had cutting-edge anti-aircraft equipment to counter the American air threat, mainly provided by the Chinese with a large contribution from USSR SAMs. The Chinese also sent 300,000 military advisors, of which a significant fraction aided in setting up integrated and overlapping fields of AA, anti-air fire. The USA employed thousands of aircrafts, ranging from B-52s to F-104's Widowmakers. Slow, heavy-hitting aircraft like F-4 Phantoms would be used to dominate engagements, being the apex predators in the sky, whilst nimble F-104S would be utilized as escorts and quick reaction forces for the slow and vulnerable B-52 bombers. F-105 Thunder Chiefs would conduct wild weasel missions where they attack SAM installations to clear part of the field for the bombers to get their work done. Such aircraft helped drop over triple the amount of ordnance deployed in all of World War II. Unconventional munitions were also strategically deployed, such as napalm, white phosphor, and Agent Orange. Napalm and the phosphor were to be used as defoliants, or a quick means to attack a hostile encampment, burning and rampaging the forest that its flames licked. The Agent Orange was also devastating, as its properties made it an excellent defoliant that cleared large swaths of the Vietnamese bush. Unfortunately, Agent Orange was carcinogenic and ended up causing severe damage to the civilian population it was dropped on, which implied that the Americans, even more unfortunately, were often bombing civilians. Due to the North Vietnamese forces having an excellent lay of the land, given it was their home, they were capable of fading into and out of the landscape, concealing bases in an improvisation of the Soviet tactic of Maskirovka. This often meant that the Americans were bombing vast expanses of unpopulated areas or villages that were home to non-combatants. Other American tactics included the up-and-coming role of close air support, made possible by Hognose Huey aircraft and AC-47 Spooky gunships. The integration of an enemy up in the sky that could respond to an offensive on a forward operating base in a matter of minutes helped turn the tide of the war, as the North Vietnamese were beaten back because they did not have many manned portable air defense systems. The efficient and huge Air Force arguably had the motto of versatility, efficiency, and experience, and the calling card of collateral damage. The land. Vietnam was nothing short of revolutionary for land-based warfare. Although hit-and-run and guerrilla tactics were practiced since time immemorial, the adaptations by both forces on the ground, given their equipment and scenario, was commendable. The North Vietnamese forces utilized a wide variety of tactics. In terms of conventional warfare, they were able to make use of some armor and effective infantry pushes into USA forces, but given their inexperience at conventional warfare, they were eventually triumphed during the Tet Offensive. Their march on Hue was characterized by a speedy, rapid offensive that took the center of the city and pushed the Americans back to the other half. The generals were, however, improperly able to apply units in an efficacious manner at times. Whilst Guyap envisioned sappers as a combat arm that conducted Ranger Demolition Commando raids, North Vietnamese officers who were inexperienced tried to use sappers as frontal assault soldiers along the entire front line, akin to shock troops, rather than the covert operators they were, who were often illogically pulled back after penetrating crucial enemy strongpoints on the battlefield. The North Vietnamese guerrilla tactics were something the Americans never experienced before or again, not during the Banana Wars or during Desert Storms. The North Vietnamese were able to make very intricate guerrilla raids onto American FOBS, forward operating bases, under the cover of nighttime and the dense foliage. Their knowledge of the terrain gave them a crucial upper hand that assisted them in setting up elaborate ambushes for U.S. troops who were sent to patrol the jungle. Such traps included pitfalls with spikes smeared with venom and snakes at the bottom, swinging balls of spikes and grenades inside of abandoned huts that made American flamethrowers think twice about some of their destructive tendencies. Most of all, the North Vietnamese were effectively masters of maintaining long supply lines. Sure, the USA had the most efficient ones, but the North Vietnamese had lines that could literally shift within 24 hours, on and back a route, almost like a Lego set, something that was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail spanned Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and was bombed repeatedly, but remained to be the saving grace of the guerrillas fighting in the south. Further, tunnel systems comparable to those of the sidewinding and dark systems seen on Okinawa were pioneered, leading to supplies being easy to smuggle from strategic hamlets and other areas to the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese strategy of Dao Tran was for the most part ineffective in the third stage, but masterfully perfected at its first and second stage. General William Westmoreland decided that the American forces would be better suited as an attrition-based force that would push forward, whilst the South Vietnamese military cleared whatever stragglers were left standing. This strategy collapsed after around a year. American troops were being sent into the jungle to patrol territories and assault objectives, being deployed from FOBS. The fact that Americans often fell back to these FOBs, where they felt safe, was ruined by the experiences they would have in the night, where a team of sappers would come and blow up arms depots. Soon, American troops felt unsafe in the territory around their FOBs and had limited confidence in their own outposts. They would get more and more afraid of venturing out into the jungle to conduct their search and destroy patrols, creating a phenomenon somewhat like a fire-based psychosis, where troops would intentionally keep raids short and inflate their results. This segues into the aspect of American attritional doctrine which entailed a body count, how many troops the Americans killed, to project a kill-death ratio for the evaluation of effectiveness. The soldiers would almost always inflate their numbers, with this entire doctrine being labeled as combat ineffective by the Army Chief of Staff, General Harold Johnson's report, Pro-VN, which scrutinized Westmoreland's tactics. Alas, this report was to no avail given the obstinate nature of LBJ. Americans were focused on fighting on their own terms, but this was rarely ever the case given the North Vietnamese nature of being so adept at guerrilla tactics. A significant portion of American troops did go to the Jungle Warfare School to understand how to counter guerrilla tactics, but owing to the one-year rotation period implemented by High Command, those who had just begun stepping into their stride in the forest were pulled out before they could make any vital impact. Forrest Gump, the critically acclaimed Tom Hanks movie, also shows how the Americans went as far as to draft, forcefully send conscripts, mentally disadvantaged people, called McNamara's morons, unofficially, to fight in this far-off jungle. Americans who were experienced typically tended to be the SOF, Special Operations Forces, operators, like Navy SEALS, Green Berets, and MACVSOG. Their tactics were far more advanced than regular Marines and Army's search and destroy missions, going in guns, blazing into villages, and burning down things perceived as hostile. These tactics included their own guerrilla and infiltration missions. One of the prominent sabotage missions conducted by MAC v SOG was when they switched Chinese-supplied bullets for ones that would blow up in the user's face to undermine the relationship between Vietnamese and the Chinese. Another was where they played ghost sounds from helicopters and speakers attached to their backs outside of Vietnamese camps to try to scare troops, although it raised morale. The most peculiar was where a group of operators kidnapped fishermen and brainwashed them into disseminating information about an American-controlled radio station that allegedly had North Vietnamese dissenters, which aimed to spread sedition amongst Hanoi's ranks. Other unique tactics were pioneered to counter the dexterously crafted supply lines and hideouts of the North Vietnamese, which typically lay under the soil the American troops fought on in tunnels. When such a tunnel was encountered, it could either mean that there were enemies in there along with their supplies, traps waiting to kill Americans, or both combined. In such predicaments, platoons would become what they sought to fight against: communist. They nominated the shortest man, called a tunnel rat, arguably the bravest men of the war who were voluntold to go clear a tunnel, armed with a light that they didn't use because it gave away their position, and a knife. Under General Creighton Abrams, the tactics in the Vietnam War shifted from attrition to more fluid front lines that focused on outflanking and neutralizing enemy areas of operation. As for armored warfare, its scope was severely limited in Vietnam to an urban perspective and area of operations, where mechanized infantry and tanks served as the coup de grace during the Test Offensive, repelling Hanoi's attack. Both sides made good and bad use of a plethora of tactics. But ultimately, as the saying goes, when the American troops took the villages in the day, the VC came and reclaimed them under the cover of darkness in the night. The Americans felt that by bombing the Vietnamese and destroying large amounts of their units, they could break their resolve. Hamlets, blocked from providing resources, were bypassed. Bombs had a 50-50 chance of landing on the right target, not in reality just an exaggeration. And the Americans did not understand the greatest allies the North Vietnamese had: time and will. The Vietnamese had been fighting for years. Another decade meant little to them. They would not crumble another foreign nation. The hunger for independence triumphed above all. So what were the mistakes made by America in dealing with the communist threat in Vietnam, and how did they lead to increased VC participation? The American intervention in Vietnam was fundamentally undermined by a series of miscalculations regarding the nature of the enemy and the effectiveness of industrial-scale warfare. Central to this was a flawed perception of the cost of war as a deterrent. The U.S. leadership believed that through relentless carpet bombing and the infliction of mass casualties, they could eventually reach a breaking point that would dissuade the North Vietnamese from prolonging the conflict. However, this logic failed because Washington viewed the struggle through a rigid Cold War lens, perceiving Ho Chi Minh and his forces as mere puppets of the Soviet Union and Communist China. By framing the war purely as a battle between communism and capitalism, the U.S. ignored the deep-rooted nationalism that fueled the North. This led to a catastrophic underestimation of the enemy's motive. While the U.S. was fighting for the abstract geopolitical goal of containment, the North Vietnamese were engaged in an existential war for sovereignty and unification. Consequently, the North was willing to sustain levels of casualties that would have been unthinkable for a Western democracy. These errors in perception transitioned into disastrous military policies, most notably the strategy of attrition. By focusing on casualty rates, the U.S. command ignored the geographical and demographic realities of the region. The North Vietnamese possessed a seemingly endless supply of manpower and reinforcements, and they utilized the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of paths through neutral Laos and Cambodia, to maintain their logistics beyond the reach of conventional American ground forces. This was exacerbated by the policy of graduated pressure. Rather than delivering a decisive blow, the U.S. increased its military presence in slow intervals. This incremental approach was intended to signal resolve, but in practice it granted the North Vietnamese the time they needed to adapt. They used these intervals to construct one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in history and move their vital operations into vast underground complexes, effectively neutralizing the American technological advantage. The internal management of the war effort further crippled American effectiveness through the use of the draft and 12-month tours of duty. By deploying young men with little to no military combat experience into a territory that was completely alien to them, the U.S. ensured its troops remained in the back seat of the war. Furthermore, just as soldiers began to adapt to the grueling environment and guerrilla tactics, their tours would end. This revolving door policy meant the front lines were constantly manned by freshmen who were vulnerable to experienced North Vietnamese guerrillas. On the political front, the U.S. decision to back Ngo Dinh Diem proved to be a strategic liability. Supporting a leader whose presidency was marked by corruption and the persecution of his own people made the American goal of instilling democracy appear hypocritical. This backing of a dictator severely damaged the U.S. image and cost them popular support even among many in the South Vietnamese population. On a tactical level, the U.S. relied on methods that frequently backfired. Search and destroy missions were designed to clear territory, yet American troops rarely held control of the ground they took, allowing the Viet Cong to reoccupy areas as soon as the U.S. moved on. The resulting alienation of civilians became a turning point. The use of Agent Orange to destroy crops and Zippo raids to burn villages suspected of harboring insurgents left the peasantry with no choice but to turn to the north for security. Programs like the strategic hamlets, which forcibly moved villagers into fortified camps away from their ancestral homes and burial grounds, created deep grievances that the Viet Cong easily exploited for recruitment. Finally, a massive intelligence gap hindered every operation. While the U.S. often relied on aerial surveillance for intelligence, they remained largely blind to the enemy's movements beneath the dense forest canopy or within the intricate underground tunnel systems, leaving the world's most powerful military struggling to pin down an invisible foe.